Everyone to our ACT-CTU rounds. So if you're familiar with our rounds, we usually have a speaker and an expert on a specific topic and we'll provide a talk on that topic and then followed by a discussion, as Susan said. So this is our fourth rounds, and today we welcome Dr. Lawrence Mbuagbaw, who is an associate professor at McMaster University, where he teaches courses in biostats and randomized trials. He's also an associate professor extraordinary of epidemiology and biostatistics at Stellenbosch University, which I understand is in South Africa, and research methods scientist in the Research Institute of St. Joseph's Healthcare Hamilton, where he provides methodological and statistical support for other researchers as the director of the Biostatistics Unit. And this includes research questions, formulation, study design, data analysis, and reporting, exactly what we're here for. He's the principal investigator of numerous research projects covering a wide variety of research designs, including evidence synthesis, randomized control trials, mixed method studies, and qualitative studies. And he's authored over 300 peer-reviewed publications and is a senior editor for the journal Pilot and Feasibility Studies. So welcome, Dr. Mbuagbaw. It's a real pleasure to have you today. We really appreciate this talk. And as I mentioned to you earlier, we did have an RFA as part of our ACT-CTU, specifically on pilot RCTs, which the results will be coming out shortly. So this will be, I think, really informative for everyone. So with that, I'll hand that over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And it's an honor for me to be here, and I'm pleased to share what I have with you. It turns out we are currently reviewing CIHR grants, and quite a few of them are pilot RCTs. And there are a number of concerns which we see with these RCTs, and some of the reasons why studies get funded or do not get funded will likely be covered in this talk. So I put together some learning objectives, which we can go through. Let's see. And the first is for you to be able to define a pilot study, and then to understand the reasons for conducting a pilot study, to be able to justify a sample size for a pilot study, to be able to evaluate the success of a pilot study, and then to be able to address ethical issues with pilot studies. And then after we cover these objectives, I'll go through some of the frequently asked questions people have about pilot studies. Some of these questions are collected from our method support unit, and there are questions which keep coming up for many people who are interested in conducting pilot studies. So in order to clarify what pilot studies are, we looked up some of the stats and epi dictionary definitions. And one of them states it's a small scale test of the methods and procedures to be used on a larger scale. And if the pilot study demonstrates that the methods and procedures can work, and then you move to the larger scale study. The Dictionary of Medical Statistics calls it a small scale investigation designed to test the feasibility of methods and procedures for later use on a large scale, or to search for possible effects and associations that may be worth following up in a subsequent larger study. There are several other definitions for pilot studies, but the key takeaway from this is that they are generally not designed to test efficacy, and trying to determine intervention effects from a pilot study is a flaw, and it will compromise the integrity of your study. So if we go back into what current practice is, a lot of different studies have been conducted on the lay of the land for pilot studies. And one of the things which they found is that there is no consensus on the definition of pilot studies as used in journals, and it's unclear whether a pilot study and a feasibility study is the same. Further, if you look at the kinds of terminology that are used, there's also no clear distinction between what people call pilot work, pilot study, feasibility study, and pilot trial. And these are all used interchangeably, right? And people don't really clarify what they mean. But further down the line, I will explain to you what the difference between a pilot and a feasibility study is. The problem is further confounded by the fact that journals themselves have no clarity on how to deal with pilot and feasibility studies. So in 2000, our group looked at how pilot and feasibility studies were managed in 7 big journals. And we identified 90 unique studies, and only 4 out of 90 specifically stated that the pilot study was done in preparation for a bigger RCT, which is a problem. And when we spoke to the editors of these journals, 4 out of 7 indicated that they had no policy, no publication policy for pilot and feasibility studies. And 1 out of 7 of the journals indicated that they did not publish pilot studies, even though we found pilot studies in their journals, right? So a few years later, we replicated the same study, and with 54 unique studies, the editors of the journal still said they had no publication policy on pilot and feasibility studies. And this is concerning because pilot studies are important, and yet certain journals do not have a specific approach to how they deal with pilot studies. Furthermore, we found that among 41 pilot trials published in circulation, the editors sometimes requested that the authors change the title to pilot simply because the study was small. Again, this is an inappropriate practice, right? Because a pilot study is a unique research entity, and it is not a fallback for when an RCT is too small or when an RCT is not generalizable. So why would you be interested in conducting a pilot study? The reasons can be grouped into 4 main categories. The first is to assess process issues in your study, right? So you can be looking at recruitment rate, eligibility criteria, adherence rates, dropout rates, retention rates. You can also use a pilot study to look at the resources required. So how much staff do you need? How much time does it take to complete forms? What are the costs required to implement the study? And then you could also look at management issues in terms of the challenges staff face in collecting data, in following up participants, in ensuring that the study works well. You could also look at issues related to data entry and if there are any challenges with data entry. And then you can also do some of the hardcore science and look at scientific and methodological issues, like whether you're capturing the right outcomes, whether the intervention is safe. You can also look at the treatment effect and sometimes the variance of the treatment effect, so you get a sense of the magnitude of change to expect in a larger study. So here are some examples of pilot studies that have been conducted with key feasibility outcomes, which are very important to report in the pilot study, and it is generally recommended that these be reported as primary. This study here on a depression intervention looked at recruitment rates, retention rates, data completeness rates, feedback on the intervention, and the resources required to conduct the main study. So some of the issues we've mentioned earlier on. This study on probiotics looked at recruitment rates, protocol adherence, the levels of contaminations, and aim to capture an acceptable ventilator-assisted pneumonia rate. This study on vitamin D and osteoporosis looked at recruitment rates, retention rates, participation rates, completion of action plans, feedback reports, and completeness of data. And this one here looked at adherence rates, right? So the common theme between all of these studies is that recruitment is a key aspect of feasibility, right? This is something that you want to make sure you have nailed down, because if you can't enroll people in your study and then there's no way of doing the study. And if you enroll people in your study and they don't adhere to the intervention, be it the intervention itself or the counterfactual, the control, and then your trial isn't going to be successful. And likewise, if everybody drops out of your study, as measured by your retention rate, and then the study is just not feasible, right? So it's important. These are key aspects of feasibility that show up in many well-conducted pilot studies. Now, how would you justify the sample size for a pilot or feasibility study? Emphasis here on the word justification and not so much calculation, because you're not really doing a calculation, right? It's more of a justification, which can be done in several different ways. So the literature varies a lot on how this can be done. Initially, it was recommended that you should use the confidence interval for a given precision around an anticipated value or quantity of interest. For example, if you're aiming for a recruitment rate of, say, 80%, that is 80% of the people you approach agree to participate in your study. And then you can put a confidence interval around that and estimate how many people are needed to reach that confidence interval with a particular level of precision. And then there's some people who recommend rules of thumb where they say, for example, you need at least 12 patients per group based on this rule of thumb. There are other approaches as well where they ask you to use the upper bound of the 95% confidence interval, and you should make sure you should have no less than 50 per group, right? And then there's another rule of thumb which recommends to use 30 patients to estimate the standard deviation, and then use 80% and 90% confidence intervals of the standard deviation to plan the main study. More recently, another paper summarized all of these existing approaches, right? And if you look at the summaries here, you can see that they are fairly variable in terms of how many people you need to estimate a sample size. There's even more papers coming out, and another one suggests for a continuous outcome, use 35 per group, and for a binary outcome, use 60 per group, right? But the bottom line is whichever approach you choose, you should be able to justify it within the context of your study and say exactly why you chose the numbers that you're choosing. You need to be able to say why 30 participants is the right number of participants for your study. So the challenges with the above approaches is that there's great variability, right? Depending on which source you choose, you may end up with a different sample size. And all of these approaches depend on a single criterion. So they may be dependent on your retention rate or your adherence rate or your enrollment rate, right? But you could potentially want to estimate your sample size based on more than one of these feasibility outcomes. And then the last challenge with these approaches is that they're not really linked to the progression criteria. So I'll talk about progression criteria in a minute. Progression criteria are the thresholds for your feasibility outcomes that must be met for you to say a larger trial is feasible, right? So given all the concerns with how to develop and justify a sample size for a pilot RCT, there's a new approach that has recently been published, which is about testing the null hypothesis for your ability to meet your progression criteria. And with this approach, you can include all the progression criteria, all the feasibility outcomes that constitute your progression criteria, and do a test of the null hypothesis of reaching your progression criteria, and you can use that to estimate a sample size. This is fairly novel and many people are not familiar with it, but it is a reasonable approach to using to determine the sample size for pilot studies. So the bottom line is that there are multiple approaches, but ultimately a justification is needed. You need to say why this is the number of people that you're going to include in your study. Now, if you're setting up a pilot study, you need to set up criteria for determining the success of your feasibility assessment. And these are the criteria I called the progression criteria, right? And what is recommended is for you to use the traffic light approach. And the traffic light approach essentially has a red light, an amber light, and a green light. And the red light means you should not move forward with a main study because it's just not feasible. For example, if you are aiming to recruit 80% of the people you approach and you are able to recruit only 5%, this study is likely not feasible, right? But if you're aiming for 80 and you get 75, and then you could possibly modify your protocol and make the study feasible, right? So there are two levels of the amber where you can continue and modify your protocol because it's feasible with modifications, or you can continue without modifications, but you have to monitor closely to ensure that you're meeting those thresholds that you want. And then sometimes you meet all of your progression criteria and your study is feasible as is, right? But it is important for the progression criteria to be stated before. This is very similar to the hypothesis of a standard two-arm comparative trial. You need to state the direction of your hypothesis before you start the study. And these progression criteria should be based on the key primary feasibility aims of the study, right? And Other work has been done to determine some of the key features of what should be in a pilot study. And among them, including stating that pilot trials are small-scale randomized trials with specific objectives, and they are useful tools for assessing the feasibility of a larger trial. But the criteria for determining the success of each feasibility outcome must be determined, right? Each time you have a feasibility outcome, you must say, when we reach this threshold, and then we will declare that a larger trial is feasible. And if you don't reach the threshold, and then a larger trial is no longer feasible. This is particularly important because there is recent data suggesting that the UK the UK NICE saved close to £40 million each year just by doing pilot studies, because these pilot studies have demonstrated that certain large RCTs are not feasible, and therefore the government has saved money, right? So pilot studies play that important role. Here's an example of a study on strategies to enhance venous thromboprophylaxis in hospitalized patients. And the main objective was to determine the adherence rate to the risk assessment model. And a larger study will be considered feasible if the risk assessment form is completed in greater than 70% of eligible patients, right? So if you do it this way, and then it is clear what your target is, and it is clear how your results will be interpreted when you have them. Here is another example of a study where they clearly outlined their progression criteria, and as recommended practice, they report what they observe next to it. For example, their recruitment target was 40%, but they observed 22%, right? Suggesting that acceptance was lower than they planned. Their retention rate that they planned for was 80%, but they were only able to retain 63%, right? So if you present the results this way, it clearly gives you a way to interpret the feasibility of your study. Here is another example of a pilot trial on rituximab or placebo for non-splenectomized patients with immune thrombocytopenia. And their criteria for success of feasibility was recruitment of 60 patients in 12 months, administration of drug infusions in at least 54 of 60 patients, complete follow-up for at least 50 of 60 patients, and successful blinding of patients and staff, right? So these are the things which they thought were very important to ensure that a larger trial is feasible. However, I did some research looking at how progression criteria are planned for in the protocols of pilot studies. And I looked in 3 journals, which at the time were the only ones that published pilot studies. So Pilot and Feasibility Studies, Trials, and BMJ Open, right? And what we found was out of 227 articles, only 47 actually reported progression criteria. So just shy of 20%. And we found that studies in North America were more likely to use progression criteria. But however, there were improvements over time, suggesting that people are using progression criteria more and more, which means the evidence base and investigators' knowledge is improving. With this same data, we also looked at the use of qualitative data, because qualitative data is important to pilot studies. It helps contextualize the findings. And we found out about close to 40% of the studies plan to use qualitative data in the assessment of feasibility. Studies from Europe were more likely to use qualitative data. Larger studies were more likely to use qualitative data, but however, studies of pharmacological interventions were less likely to use qualitative data. And now there are additional challenges with pilot studies. The first is that most of them are not well designed. So there are no clear feasibility objectives. There is no clear rationale for piloting, no clear analytical plans, and no clear criteria for success of feasibility. And then most of them are not reported or published because they are small. And it is also dangerous to use pilot studies to estimate treatment effects, because sometimes the estimates can be unrealistic and biased, especially if the pilot studies are very small. And also, the results of pilot studies can potentially mislead sample size calculations. And there are studies that have demonstrated that either the variances are too large or the estimates of effects are just wrong. So there are some common misconceptions with what pilot studies are, right? People think it's just a small study that can be completed quickly, often, done by a student or an intern, and then they just label it as a pilot. Or it's a small study that doesn't require any funding. Because people don't have funding, they do a study and call it a pilot. But the point ultimately is that you determine that you want to do a pilot to determine if it is feasible to do a larger study. So that has to be set out a priori, right? Small studies with no funding tend to claim that they're pilots, and that is problematic. Also, small single center studies. And then sometimes they say, well, other people did a study with 6 patients and they got statistical significance. Ours is larger, so we are doing better than them. And then they call it a pilot study, even though you cannot identify what information they're going to use from that study to inform a larger study. And there are several other concerns. So this next part of my talk is tied to the frequently asked questions that we receive for people interested in working on pilot studies. So can I publish the results of a pilot study? Yes, absolutely. You should. Every attempt should be made to publish them, right? And why is it important to publish these results? Because it provides information on feasibility to the research community. It saves resources, right? It avoids duplication of effort. If you've tried something and it doesn't work, people should know it doesn't work. If you've tried it and it worked, everybody should know it works, right? And then we have an ethical and scientific obligation to publish pilot studies as well, because we have worked with patients, we have used their time, and we have involved them in the research. Further down, I will talk about the ethics of pilot studies as well. So we'll cover this point in more detail. So most pilot studies do not show statistically significant results, and people don't know what to do, right? But again, the focus in reporting the results of a pilot study should be on feasibility, not statistical significance, right? And there is a constant extension for pilot and feasibility studies, which clearly emphasizes this point. You're expected to report the results of the outcome in both arms with 95% confidence intervals, and not to do any hypothesis testing because you're underpowered for hypothesis testing. And obviously, no evidence of effect is not evidence of no effect. So even if your pilot study doesn't show an effect, it doesn't mean that there is none. It might just mean that you need a larger full-scale trial to detect one. Another important question people ask us is what a Vanguard study is. A Vanguard study is a synonym for an internal pilot study. And the idea is that it's a small study with the same design as the larger study. And if certain feasibility criteria are met, it continues into the larger study. So it is a seamless blend of a small study that tests the waters. And then if everything is going well, say recruitment, adherence, and then you can move into the larger study. You can also use a Vanguard study in terms of determining whether a sample size re-estimation is needed or not. More questions, a little bit more broad this time. Can I combine data from a pilot with data from the main study? Yes, you can, provided the sampling frame is the same and so is the methodology. So essentially, if you have the same PICO, you're allowed to merge the data from your pilot study with your main study. Can I combine the results of a pilot study with the results of another study or in a meta-analysis? Absolutely, yes, provided you have the same PICO. And in fact, you can merge the data from several pilot studies to overcome the issue of sample size and improve your precision. Can a pilot study ever exist on its own? Obviously, yes. It may show that it's feasible to go to the main study, or it may show that it's not feasible. And sometimes you can demonstrate feasibility, but you don't yet have funding for the main study. So the pilot study will stand on its own until you're able to move forward with the main study. Can I apply for funding for a pilot study? Absolutely, yes, right? It is like any grant, is important to justify the need for piloting and to apply for funding for pilot studies, because pilot studies are important. And as I have mentioned earlier on, they help save money and they're very important. Right now, we're reviewing CIHR grants, and I would say close to 70, 80% of the RCTs submitted are pilot studies. And there are other important issues to consider. So can I randomize patients in a pilot study? Yes, you can. You might even be testing to see if randomization works in your pilot study, if randomization is acceptable to participants. That might be a feasibility question that you're trying to answer. And in principle, if you're planning for a randomized trial, and then your pilot should also be randomized so that the methodology is tested. Can I use the pilot to estimate the sample size for the main trial? Yes, but be cautious, right? Consider supplementing with qualitative information and other studies so that you are more accurate in your estimations. And then it's recommended to use a sample size table to capture any uncertainties that you have, right? By producing a range of estimates in your sample size calculation. People usually do that with figures, and that is a very good practice. Can I use the results of a pilot study to treat my patients? No, not a good idea, right? Pilot studies are essentially for feasibility. And what can I do with a failed or bad pilot study? No study is a complete failure. It can also always be used as an example of what not to do, right? It helps in its own way. Should pilot studies be registered? Absolutely, yes. If you go on clinicaltrials.gov, you will see several examples of pilot studies that have been registered. So let's talk now about some of the ethical issues related to pilot studies. And some of the questions which come up is whether it's ethical to conduct a study whose feasibility cannot be guaranteed, and a study that would not generate new knowledge for the patients, right? And what obligations do you have to patients to disclose the feasibility nature of pilot studies? Well, the consent form should be explicit about the feasibility nature of the study. And there are 4 things which you need to address in your pilot study. The first is the overall purpose of the pilot study is to assess the feasibility of conducting a larger study. This should be in your consent form. Participants should know this, right? And then you also need to educate them on what a pilot study is so that it is clear what they are engaging in. Then you list the feasibility objectives of the study, and then you tell them what your progression criteria are. So what metrics you need to meet to be able to carry on with the main study. And interestingly, while it was not previously mentioned in TCPS2, now TCPS2 Chapter 11 does mention pilot trials, right? And they clearly state, as you'll see on the line here, that RABs must ensure that the recruitment and consent processes for pilot trials disclose their true purpose and do not overestimate potential benefits or underplay the risks. So some key messages, pilot studies provide a good opportunity to assess feasibility of large-scale intervention studies, and they can enhance the chances of success in the main study. However, most are not well designed with no clear feasibility objectives, no clear rationale for piloting, no clear analytical plans, and no clear criteria for success of feasibility. Many of them are never reported and many of them are never published, but they should be scrutinized to the same level as full-scale RCTs. They also require registration and they should be published and reported in peer-reviewed journals. So I have presented a rather dire picture, but there's some good news, right? There is a great framework for understanding the difference between pilot and feasibility studies. So feasibility is an umbrella term which relates to asking whether something can be done, whether it should be done, and how, right? And then the pilot study asks the same question, but it also has a specific design feature. So in a pilot study, a future study or part of a future study is conducted on a smaller scale, right? So if you conduct an RCT to inform a larger study, which is a cluster RCT, the design has changed, right? Which means the first study you conducted was a feasibility study, not a pilot study. If it is a pilot study and then the same design feature is carried out from the pilot to the main study, that's the key difference between pilot and feasibility studies. So pilot studies are a subset of feasibility studies, right? And randomized pilot studies are a subset of pilot studies. By this, I mean you can conduct a pilot study which is not randomized if you are confident that your randomized procedures will work in your larger trial and you don't need to test them in a smaller study. So in 2015, a journal was launched dedicated to pilot and feasibility studies. The journal is called Pilot and Feasibility Studies, and it's an excellent place to put your pilot and feasibility studies because they recognize the need and importance for pilot and feasibility studies, and they provide sufficient guidance on how the pilot studies should be structured, and they help the authors to structure their pilot studies in a way that they can be informative to future studies and to other researchers. So I would just like to put out some of the resources that are available, including the Consort extension for randomized pilot and feasibility studies, an editorial, which is a guide to reporting the protocols of pilot and feasibility studies, and the seminal paper on pilot studies, which covers a lot of the issues which I have mentioned here. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much. I know you can't see us, but Dr. Mbuagbaw, that was really fantastic, really practical tips. And I think like a lot of actually your FAQs at the end there answered a lot of my questions going in. So that was super helpful. I have a couple of questions, and then if it's okay, I'll open it up. I see someone else has their hand, and there may be a comment in the chat. I guess one of my main points or questions is that I think, many of us know the importance of pilot trials prior to putting in, your large full-scale application. And I think just to emphasize how important that pilot trial might be, or I guess a side question for you is, do we really need a pilot trial before doing a large-scale RCT? Or as you mentioned, there's other types of studies that may not require randomization. Maybe you're piloting an intervention without the randomization part. But to me, I guess I always thought you really need that pilot trial bit to kind of make sure that it's feasible and that you're kind of emulating kind of the key methodological aspects for your larger study. And how important that really is in terms of, I guess, when we think about resources and the cost of the larger trials, to really kind of hammer that out, earlier on in a small scale sort of a small scale trial, I guess, prior to embarking on that large trial. I just want to make sure that to me, I think that's a really important point. I just want to make sure to get your view on that.
Yeah, thanks for that. So the key question here is, how much uncertainty do you have for your larger trial? If you're uncertain that people will be willing to participate, if you're uncertain that they will accept randomization, if you're uncertain that they want to be enrolled, if you're uncertain that they want to do 4 visits per week to the clinic, if you're uncertain that they want to be in a trial where you will follow them up for 3-4 years, then you should do a pilot study to address all those uncertainties. In many instances, you may be conducting research on a topic where some of these things have been addressed. Maybe you're just changing the intervention or a few other methodological details. And then you probably don't need a pilot study, right? Because people have done similar research and you have a sense of how these things will work. But depending on the levels of uncertainty you have with any of those details you've mentioned, absolutely go for a pilot study first. And ideally, you would structure your pilot study as a vanguard study. So as soon as you start, if things are going on well, and if you have enough funding, you continue with the larger part of the study.
Great, thank you. And just to touch on that last point with the Vanguard study, it does seem to be the more efficient way to go, since obviously that sample size becomes a part of the larger sample size for your final trial. How much flexibility do you think there is in terms of your traffic light analogy with respect to modification of the protocol and still being, allowed to be part of the larger trial? So I guess in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, if you change the recruitment strategy, it's probably still fine. But if you modify maybe part of the adherent, like let's say your adherence is low and you notice, oh, well, wait a second, maybe we need to add an educational component to our intervention. Now, does that modify the intervention enough that now you no longer can keep it, as an internal pilot, but now maybe it's, a major protocol change and it really does need to be starting from fresh and you can't include those, those participants as part of the trial? I guess that requires a little bit of decision making there. I'm wondering what you think of that.
Yeah, so that's a very good point. And there are several ways to go about this. So sometimes you may have to modify certain things in your trial to make sure it works well. And look at it from the PICO perspective. Has the PICO changed, yes or no? If you haven't changed the enrollment criteria, for example, the eligibility criteria, you haven't changed the intervention, the comparison, or any of the outcomes you're measuring, and then you're fine. But in some instances, the intervention might change slightly where you're trying to enhance adherence, right? You're trying to enhance compliance, or you're giving people phone calls to, increase their engagement in the intervention. And then what you can do is to capture that as a variable in your analysis so that when you're presenting your data, you can say, here are the results of the Vanguard study overall. Here are the results from the pilot part, and here are the results, from the main study where we added these enhancements. And if you can show that it did not materially change anything, and then you're good to put them together. But essentially, you should have the opportunity to justify why you think, with the minor modifications you have made, it is still the same study. Because even in large RCTs that don't have a pilot component, sometimes changes happen, right? But all of those changes are reported to a DSMB, and the DSMB determines how much of a change to the actual study has been introduced.
Great, thank you. Susan, do you want to see if anyone has questions on the chat?
The person who had their hand raised put their hand down again. So the question may have been answered by what you just asked.
Okay.
Does anyone else on Zoom have a question? I know we have a number. Okay, we do have one question. What is your perspective on using previous feasibility studies in your field as your justification for your pilot sample size? Thank you for your presentation. Very useful.
Thanks, Megan. So this is one of the issues we face reviewing RCTs and also as an editor. And generally, it is not recommended to use the numbers from another study to inform the numbers in your own study, simply because those people might have gotten it wrong, right? So you need a more robust justification than that. And then you can mention other studies for sure, but that cannot be your sole justification for the sample size of your pilot study. You will need to do a little bit better than that.
I have another question.
Yeah.
Questions. Thank you. This is just so informative. My question actually follows up on Megan's question in that I do see a lot of discrepancy when I review the literature, and I may have read some of the papers that you put up there in terms of whether or not you should even include one of the aims to be sample size calculation or refining sample size calculation. Like there seems to be two schools of thought there. Like one, as you said, like it's inaccurate. The variance of the effect size probably is not accurate, but maybe, as you said, you couch it in, the larger literature and justify it that way. But some reviewers seem to really have a strong opinion on this, whether you include it or not include it as part of one of your feasibility criteria. So I'm just wondering how, as an applicant, we can kind of preemptively address that. Like, do you think, like, should we be justifying that with a framework? Like you listed that framework there. In that framework, for example, does it say it should or should not be used? Just to further kind of defend that, because I don't think all reviewers are as well versed, in pilot studies and the literature around pilot studies.
You're absolutely correct. And if you look in the literature a little bit further, what you would find is that sometimes pilot studies generate an accurate estimate for a sample size for a larger study. Sometimes they are very inaccurate. So the current guidance is to use with caution, right? And if you're writing a grant, that is probably something I will not emphasize, because it's just an area of uncertainty. It's a gray area. So I wouldn't say I want to use my pilot study to necessarily determine the sample size for a larger study, but I would say we provide some contextual information in terms of what the magnitude of effects can look like, what the range of SDs can look like. Because if you look at some of the guidance and rule of thumb that is presented, it is recommended that you get those estimates and then you use proportions of them. So at least one of the studies recommended getting the standard deviation for your treatment effect from the pilot study and then reducing it by 80 to 90%. So you have something more precise, because based on their simulation studies, the SDs from pilot studies are wider than would be needed for a larger study.
Great, thank you. Is there anyone else with a question or?
Anything else from the Zoom? Yeah, we do have one question. When publishing pilot data, reviewers have commented that I should not report on preliminary efficacy data or have it as one of my pilot study objectives, such as pre and post data from parametric testing and including both CI and p-value. Do you support we keep preliminary efficacy with parametric testing?
Thanks, Christine. So if you were conducting a randomized trial looking at mortality, for example, and you estimate your sample size for, say, mortality difference of 20%, your sample size is based on a chi-square test of the null hypothesis that there is no difference in mortality. And therefore, at the end of your trial, you can use the same chi-square test to see if there is a difference. In a pilot study, you do not build your sample size based on a test of the null hypothesis, and therefore it would be inappropriate to use any form of parametric testing to compare any differences, simply because you are not sufficiently powered to do it, and it wasn't a hypothesis that you presented upfront. The correct approach will be to report the estimates in the intervention group with confidence intervals and in the control group with confidence intervals, and not to show any p-values.
Great, anything else?
There's nothing else so far. Wait, you want to pass the microphone over?
Hi, thank you for the talk. I was just wondering if there's a specific way where we should justify choosing our progression criteria.
Sorry?
I was just wondering if there's a correct way we should be justifying our progression criteria. Like if we say we want like a 70% adherence rate, for example, or versus an 80% adherence rate.
That's a very good question. And when I started, when I started my presentation, I realized there was one extra slide which I should have added, which I haven't done. So there is almost no empirical evidence on what numbers you should choose, but essentially it is about consensus on what level of comfort you have in terms of moving forward to a larger trial. So take the scenario where you have a recruitment rate of 4%. This is probably not feasible, right? 10%, probably not feasible. 50%, depending on the effort you're willing to put in, you might say is feasible. 60%, probably more feasible. So the idea is there is a sweet spot, a number where you say, well, if we can recruit this proportion, we are happy moving forward, right? It's more of a gut feeling, and it comes with experience and consensus with colleagues. That's mostly how it is done. So you can say your team of investigators has determined that if we reach this threshold, then we are confident that, we can move forward with the study and get the numbers that we need. But on the side, for HIV research in particular, I have done the research on HIV studies categorized by the person delivering the intervention, the type of intervention it is, the country where the study is conducted, and I have come up with ballpark feasibility outcome thresholds that people can use specifically for HIV research. And I have students working on the same thing for anesthesia and for pediatrics, and hopefully those will be published soon. But the idea is, if I go into the literature and I say, for example, if I am doing a study with people who inject drugs, the typical recruitment rate is 80%. Right? So that makes it a reasonable target for a pilot study, maybe give or take 5%. I hope that helps in a way.
You have another question?
Yeah, that answers my question. Thank you very much.
There is one more question from Megan. For my feasibility study, one of my objectives will be to assess the representativeness of my sample compared to hospital administrative data during the recruitment period. I'm only recruiting from this hospital. I noticed you did not mention this in your presentation. Is representativeness of sample characteristics an uncommon feasibility objective?
Excellent question. It is it has not been in the past, but now it is more and more common. So this aspect of representation, I actually have it in my EDI talk, where I'm talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion and how to get a diverse sample. Because one of the things you can do with a feasibility study, and I'm happy you're doing it, is to determine whether it is possible to get a diverse sample. And based on the sample in your pilot study, you can say, we need to make more efforts to reach people with specific characteristics, right? For example, if you conduct your study and you find that in your pilot study, it was hard to enroll women, clearly you're doing something, you could be doing something different to enroll more women. And that is information that you learn from your pilot study and use for the larger study to have a more diverse representativeness.
That's actually really helpful. I really like that question. Thanks, Megan, and the answer. I have another question. Just with respect to qualitative data, you mentioned that qualitative data can be incorporated into pilot trials. I'm wondering if you can expand on that, and I'll also comment on the usefulness or relevance of implementation with respect to the like implementation outcomes, which I think often use qualitative data into the aims of the pilot trial.
Yeah, thanks for that. So there are a number of studies where they are trying out an intervention which is extremely novel, and they're also trying to improve the delivery of the intervention. So in addition to capturing recruitment rate, adherence rate, they actually ask participants, what did you feel about this intervention? We gave you this device to put on your chest and go around with it for 4 days. How did it feel? Did it interfere with your quality of life? Is it, are there any concerns with using it? And likewise, you can also interview the staff involved in the research, because sometimes research doesn't work because it is intrusive on clinical practice, right? But you wouldn't know this if you don't talk to staff. And this might be some of the things which are preventing the study from going on seamlessly. So these are just some examples of the kinds of qualitative data you can capture and use to improve the design of the larger study.
Wonderful, thank you. Anyone else?
There's not a question, but Megan did post an article that she found on progression criteria consensus recently from 2019. The title is Co-Producing Progression Criteria for Feasibility Studies, a partnership between patient contributors, clinicians, and researchers. And it is in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. If anyone wants to look that up.
Great. Can we add that to our link when we post it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect. Anyone else here? There's been a lot of people.
And I can share the article on HIV research progression criteria. It has a large number of numbers that you can use for HIV research in different populations and in different parts of the world.
Wonderful. That's so helpful. I think that's it.
I don't see any other questions.
No other questions? Well, with that, I just really want to thank you, Dr. Mbuagbaw. Super helpful talk. I think there's so many people here that, are interested in pilot trial, well, interested in, large scale trials, but absolutely, to do that first step in pilot trials. And I think there is sort of a general confusion sometimes. What are the actual aims of the pilot trial, and also how to align those with the larger trial. So I really thank you for clarifying that and for your time. Excellent talk. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me.